So I have a little bit of background information just to provide everyone in terms of logistics. So you're in the session in room 201, Agri-food Systems and Municipal Planning and Discussion. Just in terms of logistics, if everyone could use the app for questions, we'll also be going around with mics at the end. And if you do have an in-person question, just make sure you have the mic so the online participants can hear you. And with that, I'll pass the session over to Sara.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Regan, and welcome to everybody here for the last day of the conference. Very excited to be presenting on the topic of agri-food systems and municipal planning, a discussion for sure. So as we get started, I won't read the land acknowledgement. This is what we use at the University of Guelph. We all represent the Dish with One Spoon covenant. And I think as planners, it's a really important thing to reflect on. Our connection to land is perhaps even stronger than most other professions. And in fact, the topic we have today about agriculture and that agri-food system has an incredibly strong connection to land. And so it's something we all have to reflect on, is the territories we're operating in, what that connection to the land, the food, and those who are here before us would be. And so I'll just encourage everyone to continue thinking about that through your everyday lives. A really sort of quick preamble, I think, before we get into things today is just to reflect on the fact that we are here to talk about agriculture and agri-food systems, and that can mean anything and everything, and it's an incredibly diverse topic, from Snoop Dogg at a cannabis farm in the Niagara region to right above that, actually, light pollution from greenhouses in Essex County. So lots of different representations of agriculture, of what agriculture means, the changes we see in agriculture every day, such as the greenbelt and land use planning attached to the development of those spaces. But it's broad, it's incredibly broad. It's not this narrow definition that I think we traditionally have thought about when we think of agri-food or agriculture even, and what that looks like. For our agenda, so my role today is really facilitator, which is exciting. It's a bit more hands-off in some regards, no pressure on me today. But we'll talk about what agri-food systems actually are, the role of municipal planning departments in understanding that system, as well as the capacity to support agri-food systems in Ontario. And then following that brief presentation, we have a panel discussion with 4 planners who are actively working in this field across Ontario. We have a lot of people who are present today for our presentation, and what I'll say is on the left we have sort of the U of G cohort that will be doing the presentation piece, and then on the right we have our panelists, and we'll have them introduce themselves when we get into that part of our presentation. So I thought before we could get into things, we'll start with a bit of a Menti activity, if folks don't mind. I see phones coming out so everyone knows their role, which is amazing, thank you. So if you go to either menti.com, the code is up there, and when I flip screens, the code will come up, or if you can scan with your phone the QR code. Does it work at the back? Are you actually getting it? Because that's amazing. I saw a thumbs up. Perfect. Awesome. We'll give it one more minute, and then we'll switch to the Menti screen. And so, awesome, it's already being populated, but just curious what district folks are representing from OPPI. And again, if you didn't get the QR code, the code for the Menti, if you go to menti.com, it's just up there at the top. Maybe not surprising that Eastern is so well represented. We got one from Western and one from Oak Ridge, is fantastic. So we'll go on to our next question. And curious what field, sector, etc. do you represent? And just noting what a fun resource. Back a few years ago, I think we asked these same questions and it was a show of hands. And I feel like this is a bit more engaging, and we love visualization. So always helpful to have that on screen. So municipal is definitely the bulk of folks here. And why not have some fun? So if you don't mind sharing, if you strongly agree or strongly disagree with any of these statements, they could potentially be a little divisive, but just curious what folks' thoughts are. Whether speed limits are only a suggestion, if dogs are a superior pet over cats, if driving the 401 is a fun adventure for some, and whether microwave popcorn should be ever made in the office. I don't think I thought the 401 would be divisive anyway, so very happy to see that most folks don't see it as a fun adventure, which is It's real. It's an adventure in some ways. Fun is probably not the right word. Amazing. I think I have one last Menti question before I'll turn it over to Wayne for our presentation. And so getting back to our topic, and we're thinking about agri-food systems, this will create a word cloud and you can enter as many words as you want. What words come to mind? What are some of those things you think of if someone mentions agriculture, food, agri-food? What comes to mind? Ooh, there's a bunch. Wow, some incredible diversity on here. And just noting that it's probably a little tough to see that screen, but from my side of things, it's amazing all the different words we're seeing. And I think that helps speak to, when we think of agri-food systems, how broad that is. Things like climate change, economic development, supply, sustainability, local as one of the big words on there. Food, of course, coming through for many folks. Family being another interesting one. Just amazing. And I think Wayne will get into this, but it speaks to the fact of agri-food being so incredibly broad and meaning so many different things. And I'll let this one can continue in the background, and I'll let you all keep adding words if they pop up, but I will pass it to Wayne then.
Thanks very much, Sarah. One thing I learned is if you're standing out there trying to see, don't stand in front of the mic or instead of the speakers. Anyway, my hearing is still fine, I think. Good morning, and I'm glad to see so many people out for our session. It's an important topic, and hopefully we'll get a chance for some dialogue and interaction as well. So those words that you just provided for us, which I think are quite relevant, we've tried to capture some of what we anticipated those words would be in pictures. And I credit another project that I have, that Pam Doosling is here for some of these images. But it speaks to the diversity that exists in agriculture. And as we're looking to agricultural systems, that diversity, the scale, the evolving nature, the importance of on-farm diversified uses as an example, and of course the view of cows is always important. Some more images just to get us thinking as we look to this topic. And again, it speaks to how this is evolving. It's the increasing emphasis we bring to urban agriculture, and what does that look, and how does that fit into our agri-food system? We can look at farmers markets there as an example, and I know Regan, for example, regularly participates and has worked, for example, at the farmers market in St. Jacobs. What does that look like in terms of how it contributes to our agri-food system? And we can look at the size and scale, in particular with a couple of those images. The center one there is a set of grain elevators in Hensel, Ontario, which is a small village of 1,000 people with the largest inland granary in Canada, as an example. Just again speaks to how things are evolving. I know that you had a lot of other good words to add to that, but I think it's really important that we think about these things from the point of view of what does it mean to the farm community. And I've spent a lot of my career thinking about, well, how do we as planners interact with farmers in the farm community to try to make things as positive as we can for the farm sector? And that comes to the question around farmers and their livelihoods. So with that, I've tried to identify what I think are a lot of the key issues that as farmers, they need to be thinking about in terms of viability. And again, the question is, how does that relate to municipalities, and how do those factors influence the farm sector? So I invite you to be thinking about that. Again, we can look at this slide. There's things like markets and government policy, land use policy certainly, urban pressures, physical drainage, climate, farm capital, farm expertise, services, and land base, recognizing that municipalities don't influence all of those, but they influence a few of them. So I invite you to be thinking about it. I've flagged 5 that I think are fairly core to what municipalities do, in the sense of what do we do as municipalities and how does that influence the farm sector and farm viability. So things such as the land base, a role for municipalities to a degree, certainly with services, land use policy, which I think all of you will be connected to in one way or the other, and of course that connects to urban pressures and things like physical drainage and so on. But it's often, people will say, well, planning is too interruptive, if you like, with the farm sector. But there's a whole bunch of stuff that contributes to agriculture that we as planners and, of course, as municipalities, you have limited influence over. But it's to acknowledge those sectors that we do play a significant role with. So I pose these from the point of view of thinking about the future of agriculture, because again, as planners, we want to be thinking into the long term. And I think about how things have changed in agriculture over time, and we've been on this treadmill of increasing productivity and I won't say profitability, but certainly increasing productivity, yields increasing certainly over my career. Speaking to a neighbor across the road from where I live, he's anticipating 250 bushels of corn this year, as an example. And when I was a child, if Dad had 100 bushels of corn to the acre, that was a prime yield. So what does the future look like in terms of how things might change? And there's a whole series of images that are captured there that would suggest the future might lead to increasing productivity on the farm and on agriculture, to other things such as climate change and water use and future energy that run the risk of leading to significant decreases in productivity as well. And I think those all factor into our equation as we're thinking about agri-food systems. So I also believe there's a really fundamental connection that we should celebrate with the farm community in terms of our ability as planners and as municipalities to contribute positively to the productivity of agriculture and the prosperity of the agricultural sector as well. And that future is influenced, I think, in some significant ways by planning policy. And just as a specific example, and this is more the urban perspective, anybody here from Bowmanville? Okay, great. So this is an example that a former student of mine provided to me, and people will appreciate this. This came out right after the Greenbelt, sort of 2006, 2007 timeframe. And if we look to the left, and I'm going to step away from the microphone just to point to it, those areas there, they were developments from the 1970s, right? And you can see the size and intensity of that lot pattern. Most of those lots are probably 2 acres in size. The area in red highlights an area that had a new development occurring. Again, this was in 2007, 2008, after the Greenbelt and Places to Grow. And you can see how that pattern compares to the development pattern that we were looking at in the 1970s. It's radically different. It's a reflection of the positive outcomes that can occur from good provincial policy, and it's a reflection of the outcomes that occur when municipalities embrace those standards. In terms of density of urbanization, which speaks to me of protection of farmland, right? If good things are happening in urban spaces, it leads to good things happening and less demand in the agricultural sector. And again, it's just to recognize how important that is, and the many, many other kinds of policies that the province and municipalities have brought forth in the past. So again, I've spent much of my career thinking about not only the regulatory side of things that we as planners are embraced with, but also looking to the other sectors. And you can see there's 4 quadrants to this: the regulatory, the non-regulatory, the educational, farm and non-farm, and community development. And while planning, again, often focuses on the regulatory side of things, just want to acknowledge how important it is that we have an important role in those other sectors as well. So how many people would say that you only do regulatory in your municipality? That's great. There's lots of other good things happening. So just to share some of those examples, and I'm not going to go over all of them or I will steal time from my colleagues, but I'll just pull out 1 or 2. So in the regulatory side of things, of course, that's what we typically do as land use planners in terms of official plans and bylaws and things. If you look at the non-regulatory, again, there's a whole series of things, and we'll hear some of these from our panelists. I'll just pull out clean water programs as an example that we might hear about. Again, some municipalities across the county, across the province, particularly counties and regions, have embraced the funding mechanisms to make good things happen from an environmental perspective on the farm. We have educational farm and non-farm. Times in the past I've been involved in alternative dispute resolution processes with the farm and non-farm community to make sure things are working appropriately. And again, over in the community development side of things, community economic development focused on agricultural development and opportunities, again, are good things that can occur from a municipal perspective. So we'll hear some more of some of these items as we move along. And with that, just to acknowledge that planning and agri-food systems come with politics and competing visions of the countryside. And the 2 images here, this land is our land, back off government. I often wonder how that relates. I suspect some of you out there will have had some difficult interactions with people who might embrace that perspective in the world. To a more fun perspective, and this is an American image, but just to read it out in case you can't read it from the back. Notice this property is a farm. Farms have animals. Animals make funny sounds, smell bad, and have sex outdoors. Unless you can tolerate noise, odors, and outdoor sex, don't buy property next to a farm. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Regan.
All right, perfect. Thanks, Wayne. So we're going to get back into some more participation here in just a second, but taking a few steps back, we wanted to think about what agri-food systems include. So this is a definition from the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, and I think the key message here is that agri-food systems are thinking about from the producer to the consumer, so that whole supply chain. And that really feeds into then what agri-food systems planning is. And so just reflecting on the different items here, this is from the American Planning Association, but they're talking about things like preserving existing and supporting new opportunities for local and regional urban and rural agriculture. They're talking about sustainable agriculture, supporting local and regional food value chains, facilitating community food security, promoting good nutrition and health, and then also thinking about that waste and the end use of food and food waste products. So with that in mind, we have another activity for everyone, and we're asking, how frequently do you deal with agri-food and agricultural related issues as part of your role? So just another Menti question here. So we're actually working on a research project at the University of Guelph, looking at this topic. So municipal planners deal with agri-food issues on a frequent basis, whether they're in rural or more urban roles. And so, just moving back to our presentation here, our project is based on this idea that a thriving agricultural industry depends on the knowledge and support provided by municipal governments. And so we're looking at the capacity of municipalities. Do they have staff resources, budget, knowledge on these different issues to be effectively planning, and how comfortable are they planning? And so 3 specific research questions we have are, to what extent do municipalities vary in their capacity to respond to and support the local agri-food sector? Which provincial agricultural and rural land use policies are the most challenging for municipalities to implement? And then what can be done to increase municipal capacity? And so we're actually finished data collection for this project, and we've heard from 290 municipalities from across the province, and we'll be highlighting a few of our results for this presentation before we get into our panel discussion. And Shanley will be presenting our results.
As we just asked you, one of the questions we asked the municipalities was how frequently they were dealing with agri-food related issues, and it does look like a fairly even distribution when you look at everything across Ontario. We did break it down looking at kind of the differences between northern municipalities and southern municipalities, and we did see a lot of disparity there, with a lot of the northern municipalities saying that they almost never deal with these issues. And so we also looked at kind of differences between the tiers and the different regions and across Ontario. That could be a whole entire presentation into itself, so we're not going to get too into the weeds with that right now. Another question we looked at was the sorts of agri-food system initiatives that were being run by the different municipalities. So this is going back to what Wayne was talking earlier about the different tools that they were using for supporting agri-food systems. The most frequent ones that we saw were agriculture-related economic development initiatives and kind of buy local programs. But another one that's kind of interesting to look at is the climate change strategy. About a quarter of the municipalities already had one, and a quarter of them were in the process of making one. And then we asked, how would you rate your municipality's capacity to respond to and support the agri-food systems? So we did look at kind of more quantitative measures of capacity, how much budget they had, how much staff, but this was more of a subjective measure, recognizing that there's so many things that feed into the ways that municipalities can support these issues, but also that there is kind of a need to balance out how frequently they're dealing with them. So it's not like an apples to apples comparison. If they're not dealing with these issues a lot, then they might feel like they have adequate capacity, where if you directly compared it, they have much less resources than someone that's dealing with it all the time. Okay. And so now we're going to head back to the Menti, asking what are the key agri-food related planning issues consuming staff time in your municipality?
There you go.
So some of the ones we're seeing is a lot of on-farm diversified use, loss of lands to severances, lack of strong policy and political will. And so we had also asked this, in addition to kind of our quantitative survey, we also did interviews with planners from various municipalities and asked about this as well. So some of the challenges that they brought up were limited understanding of agriculture and agri-food related systems, the need for minimum distance separation, minimum lot sizes, lot creation, on-farm diversified use, balancing competing interests, the differing views within the farm sector, as well as the role of the province. And with that, I will pass it over to Sarah, who will be doing our panel discussion.
And amazingly, we're actually ahead of schedule by a couple minutes, so that's fantastic. So I'll invite our panel up and let you get situated, and just thank Wayne, Regan, and Shanley for that overview of agri-food systems and this really intensive project, I think, that you've worked on the past year and a bit, give or take. And maybe a quick question about results and when any of that will be publicly available, if it isn't already. Within the next year. So if there's a lot of things that you really want to know about this research, give them about a year and it'll all be publicly available. And you heard it here first. April. Ooh, Regan's committing to April, so that's less than a year. So that is now on record and online. So thank you, Regan. All right, so for the visioning for this session was really to hear about research and then hear from the practitioners what they're experiencing sort of on a daily basis, if it is a daily basis in the areas they're working. And we've structured this with really only one or two sort of guided questions and then really opening it up to the audience to ask questions. You have experts at the front, and I'm sure there's experts around the room, but if you want to share your experiences or ask the panel if they've experienced things that you're seeing or how they would deal with something, absolutely take advantage of their time. So what we'll do then is I'll invite each panelist to introduce themselves and let us know where they're coming from. And as our first guided question is, what are your experiences with planning for agri-food systems? The good, the bad, the ugly. What are some of those successes and challenges you've experienced? And Anissa, I'll pass it to you first.
And I'll ask, does this work?
It does.
Okay, so my name is Anissa McAlpine. I am a planner with the City of Ottawa. I actually work in the Parks Department now, but formerly I did work as a rural development review planner with the City of Ottawa, as well as the province. And formerly, I would have been a student of Wayne Caldwell's, studying preservation of agricultural land through Ontario land use policy. Because I'm in the Parks Department now, I think I need to speak maybe more generally to the City of Ottawa experience. As we sit here in Ottawa today, I think all of us feel like we're in a major metropolitan city, but for anybody who drove here recently, you might have noticed that the Welcome to Ottawa, Bienvenue, 1 million people signs are probably a full half hour outside the city. They're out in what feel like the farm fields, and that's because our urban boundary, or our municipal boundary, is quite large. Our borders are pretty, they're akin to the former Carleton County borders. So we have a huge land base, and in fact, 80% of that land base is agricultural or rural or natural. That being said, there's 1 million people living in this city. So the issues that come before, that are on the desk of any planner or that come before a city council are probably predominated by urban issues, and it would be all too easy for agriculture and agricultural issues to play second fiddle. Would it be an appropriate time to speak to how we address that challenge?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so I would say the key ways that that's addressed in Ottawa is sort of structurally. There is a team of designated rural development review planners, of which I was formerly. There might even be some in the room here. Those planners and engineers have specific expertise in rural issues, and when they are making recommendations on rural development applications, rather than taking those recommendations to a planning committee, as I think would be done in other communities, they go to the Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee, which is comprised of municipal councillors who have, who are able to review the application through a rural lens, and many of them have strong ties to farming themselves. I also want to note that we have a Rural Affairs Office who are staff who serve as resources, as liaison to the agricultural and rural community. and who work closely with the Economic Development Office on all things rural. And I should note that all of those bodies predate my time at the city. I don't know how they came to be, but I can only imagine that they came to be through, the championing of those ideas by some strong-willed individuals or individual. I don't know, but they didn't come to be out of nothing. And so it's important to have both those structures in place, but also champions for agriculture and agri-food systems within the municipality. I'll pass it on.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hanna Holman, and I'm a planner with Huron County. And yet, Huron County does have over 50-year history in our department, where agriculture has always been at the center of what we do, just given the nature of our area being such an agriculturally intensive part of the province. It's essentially second nature to us to think about these issues on a daily basis. And we are quite fortunate to have quite a few members of our council that are farmers and have that background, as well as members of our staff. So it's something that's certainly embedded in our culture. Some of the successes that we've had in our community are the Clean Water Project, which is a $500,000 dollar fund that is supported by County Council every year, and it provides grants to landowners to do projects related to cover crops, tree planting, retiring of sensitive lands. So supporting farmers in that way, and it's also a really great program to connect with producers in the area. So that's been something that we've been fortunate to have the support of County Council on, which I think has also lended itself to allowing council to contextualize some of more of our issues that we're dealing with land use planning when development files come forward. We've also done some work to support emerging industries. So wineries is one of the emergency industries that we've seen in the last 10 years in Huron County. So with some work with our partners in economic development, we have done some work to allow more flexible zoning and official plan policies to allow for on-farm wineries. So that was work that was done, again, about 10 years ago, before some of the direction from the province on permitted uses. We also are fortunate to have good relations with our farm federations, so that would be something I would suggest to some municipalities that perhaps do not have as much capacity. Is that relationship building is really valuable, and that knowledge. We do have Sustainable Huron, which is an initiative where we connect with community members on a variety of different topics on a quarterly basis, and through that we've been able to engage with producers on various farm-related issues. One of the most recent would be on-farm labor housing. So another way a great way to build relationships and have our members of council also involved in that. The county does also operate a demonstration farm in partnership with the Huron Soil and Crop Improvement Association. So various different demonstrations on this farm for things like cover crops, drainage, no-till, which is a really great way to interact with producers and show some innovative partnerships in agriculture and practices. So I would say where we focus beyond doing our standard day-to-day planning policy is just education for the public and council, and building relationships with agriculture has been really important. In terms of challenges, things that we anticipate becoming more of a challenge in Huron County is the increase for on-farm housing and labor. Traditionally in Huron, it hasn't been as much of an issue or as popular than some other areas that have greenhouses in the province, but that's something we are seeing a little bit more interest in. So we're focusing on how to respond to that. And then we are anticipating that increased pressure for cannabis production and growing will be an issue, and that's something where our department certainly does not have the technical expertise in-house to properly respond to that. So we've been able to collaborate with some other municipalities on their approaches for that, but that's something that I certainly would see perhaps a greater role for the province. And then one other great community feature that we have in Huron County is the G2G, so the Goderich to Guelph Rail Trail. So that's been a great tourist opportunity, and given that it goes right across the county, it's also been a great educational resource for members of the public to get out and see what agricultural operations look like. So that's also been another great asset that we have. But yeah, I'll pass it along.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Pye. I'm the planner for the City of Temiskaming Shores. So we're located about halfway between North Bay and Timmins. And if you're anything like me, you had no idea that there was agriculture up there at all. So when you crest the hill in New Liskeard, it just opens up, into agricultural fields. So that area is known as the Little Clay Belt, and it stretches from Temiskaming Shores all the way up to Cochrane. So there is quite a robust agricultural community in Northern Ontario. Surprise. So we're a small municipality, so we're just under 10,000 people. We don't have the same resources as the City of Ottawa or Huron County. So we honestly, we don't do a lot in the name of, actively supporting agriculture. We have our official plan policies and our zoning bylaw provisions that are required by the province, and we deal with applications that come in on more of a case-by-case basis. So I am the only planner for the City of Temiskaming Shores, so everything that happens comes across my desk. We don't see the same kind of pressures in Northern Ontario for on-farm diversified uses as Southern Ontario is seeing, but we are very supportive of those types of applications coming into the municipality. We are very fortunate that we have an excellent economic development officer in our office as well, and we deal, so he deals with agriculture on more of a regional basis, although we don't operate under a regional government. So we have quite a strong agricultural community in our surrounding townships, and he does a lot of economic development projects with those municipalities and those farmers as well. So they've just done a farm to table program out in that community. We're holding an agriculture conference in October, and he does a lot of the trade shows and things like that, supporting agriculture in our area. So that's pretty much the extent of what we do with the limited resources that we do have in our community.
Great, thank you. My name is Scott Taylor, and I'm a planner with Grey County. I grew up on farms my entire life, but now I live in the booming metropolis of Owen Sound, so I'm not on a farm any longer. In Grey County, we have a diverse agricultural sector, and we're very, very thankful for that. We do have agricultural lands, rural lands, and special agricultural lands, in fact, which support what was traditionally the apple industry, and now there's a burgeoning grape and winery industry as well. I will say, in terms of supporting the agri-food system, I would encourage folks to think about the entire system. And that sounds kind of trite to say, but when I started in planning, I think we focused a lot on the agricultural land and the resource lands, and I didn't necessarily understand the connections to some of the uses in terms of processing or retail that were in some of our settlement areas. And that's one thing that I've come to learn through research through the University of Guelph and work that OMAFRA's done, but also in working with our economic development staff. And I will say, similar to some of the comments from the other panelists, if your municipality is looking to support agriculture and the agri-food system, it's key that all departments are on board. And economic development, as others have said, can really make planners look like superstars. They can do a lot of the on-the-ground work. They can build a lot of those relationships with the farmers and the producers, and help inform planning on where the pain points are. But it's not just economic development. Our transportation department, for example, our county roads need to be in tune too with the changing face of agriculture, as does newer departments like our climate change division. And certainly when we look at climate change, sometimes there can be fingers pointed at farmers, but we're really trying to work with the agricultural community to make sure what we're doing on a go-forward basis is sustainable. One of the other things I'll say is that there's no single face of agriculture, and we're seeing sort of the divergent ends of the spectrum from those farms that are thousands of acres and continuing to expand to the newer niche crops and some of our local food producers that are burgeoning in other parts of the county. And so one of the challenges is, if we have some of these newer producers and people that are getting into farming, how do we accommodate that given some of the inflexible policies sometimes that we have at the official plan or even the provincial policy statement level, which don't always look kindly on smaller farms. And if you were to create those smaller farms, how do you ensure they're being remaining in farm production and not being sold as larger estate lots. So I think we try to work closely with the farmers, and I think some of the advice given by the other panelists in terms of making friends with some of those farm sector groups and commodity groups and others is great. The more we can meet producers and farmers where they're at, going to their existing meetings rather than asking them to come to separate county or municipal meetings, I think is beneficial, because we all know farmers are wildly busy and don't necessarily have time for Thursday night OP meetings or anything else. So opportunities like Agricultural Advisory Committee meetings or meetings with those farm sectors is tremendously important. And I'll stop now and turn it over to our moderator.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone. I do have one more question that's just come up with some scribbles that I've been making, and then I'll open it to the floor for questions. And I'll note that if you have a question, just raise your hand, and Regan's going to come around with the microphone for you to speak into. And so my question, and anyone is welcome to answer it, and I think it's been so interesting to hear about engagement with different departments and with farmers directly and with these different committees and changes to policy and all these other pieces in the changing ag landscape. But I'm curious in sort of the work you do or don't do if you're not in the dealing with this on a day-to-day basis. But does it feel very much problem-driven, or do you see opportunities for it to be aspirational and not just reactionary when we're talking about planning for agri-food systems? Anyone want to tackle that question?
I would say we see a bit of both, and we do definitely see that problem-driven stuff. I remember a number of years ago, one of our municipalities hosted a farm tour where they took senior staff and politicians out, and it was the chance for farmers and producers to outline some of the challenges they were facing, and some of them were beyond the scope of municipal control, and others were things like, listen, if we come in for a building permit, we need that tomorrow. We don't need that, months from now. But there's lots of other things that can be aspirational, and I would point to some of the work at the provincial level and also from researchers from the University of Guelph and others around on-farm diversified uses. And we've seen tremendous investment in our area, and in some cases where farmers could buy a farm, open up a secondary business, allowed them to invest more into both the farm buildings and the land. And we know as planners it's not often we get a thank you, but we have gotten thank yous on some of that, so that's been fantastic.
Yeah, I just have a short answer to that. I think some issues were a little bit more proactive in responding to them. I think some other issues, like I said, in particular, cannabis production, that's something, again, we're anticipating. We haven't seen a lot, but that's one issue, I guess, that I would say we're hoping to get in front of, but obviously it's been a bit of a challenge. But yeah.
I guess the benefit in working in a large municipality is that we do have staff who are working specifically on policy, and we're working on updating the zoning bylaw. And absolutely, some of the thought going into that is how do we get out of the way of diversification on farm. We have already adopted at the city some provisions in the zoning bylaw to allow on-farm diversified uses and farm-related uses, and credit to my colleagues who put together like a how-to guide for farmers, directed at farmers. Like when you have departments that are able to proactively work on that, I think that's great, but I also wanted to highlight that in the Parks Department, I also, not every day, but do occasionally see agricultural issues. I got a phone call the other week from somebody who was driving a combine, and we had to talk out some recent changes to our parkland dedication bylaw as they were impacting his ability to get a building permit. So having expertise in multiple departments, and I'm going to toot my own horn here, but having some agricultural expertise myself in the Parks Department, I think meant that we were able to be reactive in a better way than we would have if we had to say, oh, I don't know anything about this, hold on, let me call the other department. That's what I have to say.
Excellent, thank you. I'll open it up to the floor if anyone would like to ask a question. Of course, I have lots more that I could pose, but the goal is to be interactive, so if there are any questions, Regan is ready. I'm terrible about waiting those 10 awkward seconds for somebody to put their hand up. Regan, yeah.
Hannah, thanks for talking about the Clean Water Project. Wayne had mentioned that to me a few weeks ago, and like $500,000 a year is incredible. Can you just speak to how that came about? Like, I imagine that was something that sort of grew over time, and is there any other matching funding, or, yeah, how did that project come about?
Yeah, thanks. So given my short history with the department, I don't have a lot of insight on particularly what the history of the project has been, but it has been longstanding. And again, we are quite fortunate that to have county council be the one pledging the funds. I think that's the one benefit of the way we operate the program is county council provides the funds. And then in terms of how the project gets implemented, we do rely on our partnerships with the Conservation Authority, as well as there's other members on the panel to select who gets the funding for that, and that's members of county council. So they're quite embedded in the process. And I think versus perhaps some other projects that are operated by conservation authorities, having council involved in that has been very helpful. I will say we're also very fortunate in Huron County to have a really strong forestry bylaw that dates back to the 1940s. So it has been a bit of a culture in Huron County and our department as a whole to have more of a stewardship mindset. So I would imagine that also helped to provide some support for starting for this clean water project. Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah, there's one on the other side of the room there.
I was just wondering, is there I'll call it an issue, but is there an issue or concern with foreign investment in agricultural land in Ontario? 'Cause that was something that I kind of heard a while back, and wondering if you have any comments on that.
I don't have any data to back up whether or not it is an issue, but it's something we've heard raised from time to time, and it's something we see a little bit with the changing face of farming in Ontario, and particularly in our county. You know, I think in the media and other places we tend to romanticize the family farm, but farming is a business like anything else, and as with business, you do see situations where those grow. And I know a number of years ago, ourselves and our partners in Bruce were struggling with questions around surplus farm dwelling severances, and it came back to some of the wording and the definitions in the PPS around farming and whether or not corporations, a numbered company, for example, could constitute a farm operation and then be severing off houses. So I'm rambling here a bit, but it's a question we hear. I don't know how much of an issue it is. I know a number of our largest farmers in Grey are locally grown and still locally living, but I don't have my handle on how much other investment might be across our county. I don't know if any other panelists have any thoughts there. But.
I'll maybe just note really quickly too, I think the National Farmers Union has done some research into that topic and have released reports on it, so I think that's probably, my advice would be to look at their reports on that. There's 3, Regan, it's up to you.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for your presentation. I guess in line with the question that was posed before, I'm really interested if you're seeing a change in the face of farming. So in terms of the kind of farmers that you see, diversity, the age, because what I've heard, and I guess totally anecdotal, so take it with a grain of salt, I suppose, but that there isn't really a succession plan for the farmers that are currently operating, and there isn't an ability for new farmers to get in because of the price of land. What's your experience with that? Do you have any anecdotal, I guess, evidence or thoughts that you can share with the rest of us?
So from a Northern Ontario context, we have definitely seen a change. So traditionally it was family farms, it was smaller operations, but with the cost of agricultural land being so much cheaper in Northern Ontario than in Southern Ontario, and now with climate change, there's a whole new opportunity up north for different types of crops. And we have seen over the past, I would say 5 to 7 years, there have been a number of large-scale operations from Southern Ontario that are now moving some of their operations to Northern Ontario. So there are 2 very large-scale potato operators that have moved up to Northern Ontario, bought up vast quantities of farmland that were traditionally just forested land, and they've gone in and cleared, and now they're planting up north, and they're buying up a lot of the smaller farms that have been listed for sale lately too, for a substantial price. So we've definitely seen a change in the scale of the operations in Northern Ontario for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I can speak to what we hear with respect to succession planning is certainly a lot of interest of farmers to sever lots for family members. In terms of how we've responded to that is moving forward with some policies to be a little bit more flexible and having additional residential units on the farm. As Scott mentioned previously, certainly seeing a lot of pressure for smaller sized farms to accommodate different types of operations, which has been quite a challenge for our department in terms of how to respond to that, as our longstanding perspective has been keeping the lots as large as possible to be flexible, which certainly does lend itself obviously to favoring those commercial-sized operations. And in particular, in the Huron context, we do have a lot of members of the Amish and Mennonite community who do operate on much smaller scales, more reminiscent of the early family farm. So there's certainly been quite a demand for them for those smaller lots. So that has been something that's been very challenging for us to balance that with the other needs of agriculture. And unfortunately, we have seen a lot of those members of the community leave the area, and partially because of that is because land values have gone up astronomically, and a lot of them have gone to Northern Ontario. So that's another big issue that we are still grappling with.
I might add, in terms of the changing face of agriculture, in Ottawa, many of you might know, we have our own green belt, which is federally owned, and there's a lot of farmland within that green belt, and it's quite close to the urban center. The City of Ottawa supports a nonprofit organization called Just Food, who operates an incubator farm within that green belt, so it's quite close to the urban center, and it provides opportunity for new farmers to test out, in a low-risk environment, a business plan. It provides access to land and equipment at low cost for new farmers, but also I understand that there are a large number of new Canadians who have participated in that program, and it's a great opportunity to recognize that there's a changing face of agriculture and provide an entry point to that.
So I have a question from online. We have a few questions, but I'll pick one online and then we can go back to the in-person audience if that's all right. So we have a question from Catherine from the Municipality of Peel. And their question is, how have recent legislative changes by the current government impacted your capacity to support agri-food systems? And then how do these changes trickle down to the farmers in your area? It's a long question. Let me know if you need me to repeat it.
Yeah, I can speak to that. I think, particular, some of the changes from the province with respect to the Greenbelt have made it a little bit more difficult in terms of our messaging of why we are protecting prime agricultural lands in Huron. If it's perceived by some farmers that, well, they can get away with it there, so why are we being treated differently? In terms of, when staff did have a dialogue with our councils about the new provincial policy statement, and in particular the proposal for 3 new non-farm residential lots on farms, that was something that was very concerning with our department. And we were very fortunate to have unanimous support from all 9 of our local councils as well as county council in terms of staff's comments and objection to this. So I will say in some ways that was an opportunity to re-educate council of why we have the agricultural policies written the way that we do. So that was, I would say, one good thing that's come about of it. I think a lot of the changes have also taken away staff capacity from maybe some other work and just trying to keep up with all the changes. I do think in particular, and I don't remember the number of the bill in specific, but the requirement that all urban lots shall be required to have 3 units, that has been one in particular that I would say has been quite helpful to communicating to council and reiterating why it's so important that if we are going to have density, that it needs to happen in our urban areas just to reduce sprawl. So that is, I would say, one positive piece.
I agree 100% with what Hannah said. I will say the one thing, and this isn't a recent change, but over the years that's helped with, back to one of the earlier questions, some of the succession planning, is increased ability for those municipalities that want to take advantage of it, of additional residential units on farms. And so, you have a farmer come to your department and say, hey, I'd love to sever a lot because, my son's ready to move out, needs a place to live. And in the past, you'd say, well, yeah, sorry, but provincial and county policy don't support that. And, maybe there's a lot elsewhere. But now having that opportunity to say, well, listen, you can't sever a lot, but actually there might be an opportunity to look at an additional dwelling unit within the farm cluster on the farm. And so I think in some cases that's been a very positive benefit. We've always had policies that allowed for farm labor accommodations, but just taking a slightly broader view there without taking much more land out of production has been very beneficial to us, I would say.
Excellent. We'll go back to, I think, a question in the room. I think there were two up here.
So 2 hands up at the front and then one over here.
Just a quick question about wineries. I'm curious to know if any of your municipalities have encountered the same type of maybe change of agriculture into breweries as opposed to wineries. We have one in Mississippi Mills, which was established before I started working there, and I was just kind of curious if you've had any or if you've ever even encountered that, and maybe off the cuff, if you would consider them the same as wineries.
We've had a burgeoning winery and cidery operations in Grey, but we've actually had some breweries as well. And we had one local success story where it was a small on-farm brewery. They were growing some things on site. They grew hops and other things, but it wasn't a massive farm, and they got popular. And actually, it was one of those few instances I can point to where the farm business got so popular, they actually bought land in a local business park, a local industrial park, and expanded their production facilities there. Typically, when we see those successful OFDUs and they get to a size where the scale becomes concerning, it's that awkward conversation of, hey, congratulations on getting successful, now please move. So we were very lucky there. We have one other on-farm brewery that I'm aware of, and again, it's very, very small in scale, more of a home business size, and they don't retail in the beer store or LCBO. It's more sort of on-farm sales. But the one thing I will say about any kind of alcohol production is we can guide them through the land use planning process, but having economic development staff or other staff that can guide them through some of those other regulatory processes for alcohol production and sale has been so helpful, because that's not something I'm very experienced with personally.
So we don't have any breweries on farm in our community, but I think, so the second part of your question was just off the cuff, whether they'd be considered the same as a winery. Again, like Scott said, depending on the scale. And if they're growing the crops on the farm itself, then I think that we would likely just consider it the same, yeah.
I would, definitely agree with both of those comments. And then in particular, where we've seen it in Huron County is along the lakeshore and Highway 21. And certainly a lot of those operations, wineries or cideries, have certainly grown to a scale that's certainly not an on-farm diversified use. And also just recognizing that there is tourism opportunities. So we have seen, those cluster along the lake.
I think we have time probably for one last question.
Thank you. So I'm curious to know, I'd love to see the conversation around really trying to ensure we have a robust agri-food system within our municipalities. But I'm curious around, from your perspective, behind the scenes, how council or staff are dealing with permissions around things that might otherwise undermine an agri-food system, such as permitting aggregate operations on prime farmland. Can you speak to maybe what sort of goes on behind the scenes from that? From the Ontario Farmland Trust perspective, we get calls probably weekly, if not more, from concerned community members about a new application, and it seems to just always be permitted, and community members are having a hard time trying to navigate and understand why certain pits would get approved over what we're saying would be kind of in opposition to wanting a strong agri-food system.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's definitely a point of conflict. I will say that, we have some farmers that have taken the view that the PPS supports aggregates, the natural environment, and then farming at the very bottom. And I can see why somebody might come to that perspective. We actually do have some local success stories, though, too. We have some farms that have opened a pit or have entered into an agreement with an operator. And the term pit is a bit of a misnomer, because in some cases what they were doing was shaving off steep slopes or knolls on the farm. And I can think of some in our specialty crop areas, particularly in Tana Blue Mountains and Meaford, where they opened a pit. It was open for 5 to 10 years and flattened out the land. And now those lands are in active orchard production. And so, I think there's this notion sometimes that pits or quarries are these huge, massive operations, and especially if they go below the water table, the only rehab plan is basically a human-made lake kind of thing. And no doubt we have seen loss of productive lands to pits and quarries. But we do have some local examples where the rehabilitation plan was successful, and arguably the lands are easier to work now. I don't know on the soil chemistry if it's exactly the same and some of the productivity in that way, but because of our rolling landscape, and in some cases some of the slopes, they weren't the easiest lands to farm in the first place.
Yeah, I would agree with all of those points, and I think, as mentioned in your presentation on Wednesday, unfortunately, it seems clear in the PPS that there is a hierarchy of aggregate being above agriculture. I think perhaps some more robust practice on what exactly an agriculture impact statement or study would look like, and making that more of a standard practice for aggregate operations. It's something in Huron County we are anticipating that we will get more aggregate operations as, some of the pits that are closer to the urban areas become more exhausted. We are anticipating that that will eventually come to our area. So the other challenge that we've had is a lot of long-standing pits that have been licensed by the ministry from the early 1990s, for example, that they still have their license. There's no sunset clause on them. They just haven't moved forward with their operations, and obviously not being able to have any control over that is something that's certainly concerning for us in particular.
Excellent. Well, I think we're right at 10:30 exactly, so hit it on the nose. And I'll start by thanking our panel for your perspectives. I think it's been so rewarding to hear, of course, the challenges, but the opportunities that we're seeing in agri-food systems, that recognition that our agri-food system and how we plan for it is incredibly broad, and there is huge opportunity to work not only to protect the land, but to protect the industry and integrate it more within our community. So thank you to our panel, our presenters, Regan, Wayne, and Shanley, and to all of you for joining us both in person and online. So hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.